Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Slugger TV. In this episode we're going to be reviewing the last stages of the 2022 Assembly election campaign. What are the main trends? What have we found? How are the parties approaching it? And to go through this topic we have got Brendan Hughes, who is the political reporter of Belfast Live, and we have Liz Nelson, who is a writer and activist. You're both very, very welcome to the programme. Brendan, I'm going to start with you first. We're now in the home stretch of the campaign. What have you made of the last 30 or so days?
I think that in the main it has been a pretty uneventful campaign that we have seen from the main parties vying for election. I suppose the main talking points that we've seen so far have been around the Northern Ireland Protocol because of the anti-protocol rallies that have been held across Northern Ireland during the campaign. And then there has also been what some parties have described as a toxic element to the campaign whenever we're seeing things like posters being either destroyed or vandalised or removed. And we saw some examples of candidates chasing people who were accused of stealing posters and things like that. So there's been that element of the campaign. But in terms of, I suppose, the nuts and bolts or parties setting out their stalls in terms of what they want to see in a future Stormont and a future Stormont executive, parties have been slow to get off the ground in that really. It's only in this last week of the campaign that we're really going to get the proper manifestos and pitches from the main 5 executive parties who are vying for votes, and that's when we'll really see where exactly the parties can potentially agree on what a future programme for government will look like, or where there will be disagreements after May the 5th.
Okay, Liz, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with Brendan. I think that in a lot of ways it's actually been a fairly dull campaign this time around. I certainly remember past elections where a lot more interesting things have happened. And I think that there really haven't been any surprises. I haven't seen anything new from any of the parties in particular. And so I think it's really going to come down to that day. I know that what we're really waiting to see is, is Sinn Féin going to unseat the DUP? Are there going to be big shifts in numbers? And that's the kind of thing we're really not going to see until, well, the few days after. So leading up to it, it's been quiet, surprisingly.
Yeah, and before we went into it, we were kind of thinking about this could be a really fractious campaign. This could be really difficult. We could see a lot of very heated debate, but hasn't materialised so far.
There's an absence of, I suppose, proper debates between the parties over what they want to do in a future executive and where they differ in terms of policy. I think that as we get to the latter stages, the last few days of the campaign, there are a number of televised debates that have been scheduled, and I think that's where we may see sparks fly between some of the leaders of the different parties. But at the moment there has been a number of sort of piecemeal approach really to launching their different policies, whether that's through candidate launches or through manifesto launches. And so therefore we haven't really seen the parties come to blows really, verbally come to blows over what their different stalls are. So I think that we might see that towards the latter stages of the campaign. And as we've seen in polling, there is a significant number of people who are undecided on how they may vote in this election. So people really will want to see what the different policies are of the parties, where they differ, and see them really debating those policies on something like a televised platform so that they can make up their minds. And so therefore there could be a lot to play for as we get into those last few days of the campaign.
And just on this, because obviously last time we were all kind of pleasantly surprised, the turnout jumped 10 points, just 65%, which was good for a Northern Ireland election. Do you think that there is much engagement this time with voters, or do you think that people are maybe just hanging back a wee bit and just thinking, oh my days, this isn't engaging me at all? What do you think?
I think it really could go either that, one of two ways, that people are just completely tired of the way the politics have been going here, very frustrated with decisions by some of the leading parties to pull down the executive in the midst of quite a few crises that we are all dealing with. On the other hand, I think that could actually, in the long run, lead to a lot more people going to the polls and hopefully using their vote to say, this is not how we want this place run anymore. We do actually want to focus on policies. And I think that's actually really important that Brendan said that there are a lot of undecided voters. to my mind, that leaves a bit of a glimmer of hope, I suppose, that people will actually be making those decisions and really looking, okay, well, who is going to go into Stormont? Who is going to make decisions that will actually have a positive impact on me and my family and my community versus, I think that there's a tendency to assume anyway in this part of the world that when people aren't undecided, it's because they're likely to vote perhaps similar ways to the way that they have always voted or been expected to vote. So I'd like to think that that means that we're going to have more people turning out. I think that over the last few years, we've seen the importance of having good governance, certainly with the pandemic and other issues as well, that I think that point has been driven home to people, and I would hope that translates at the ballot as well.
Yeah, and if we kind of break this down, right, and we look at the 5 main parties, because everyone's trying to achieve different things in this campaign, and they're all trying to do different things in this campaign. So I just want to start off with the DUP and review their campaign. This is Jeffrey Donaldson's first campaign as DUP leader. And again, probably the most high stakes campaign that the DUP have probably had since 2003. Brendan, how do you think the DUP have approached the election? Seems to be a kind of low level. They don't seem to be rocking too many boats. What have you made of their approach?
Well, the DUP have had a big challenge going into this election because, as we know, it was around this time last year that there was the coup against Arlene Foster, and then we had the, leadership crisis within the DUP. We had 3 weeks of Edwin Poots being installed as leader, and then eventually now we have Sir Jeffrey Donaldson as leader. And they've been seeing this fluctuation in the polls, that their figures have been going down, and that there's been dissatisfaction over the DUP's approach to things like Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so really, we've seen the DUP in election mode for a number of months now, really since September time last year, and their strategy has been really the same since then. In my view, they have been trying to claw back support that has been moving towards the more hardline TUV, Jim Allister's TUV, who are more hardline on the protocol, and so the DUP has been trying to move in on that space, and they've been doing that in a number of ways. Firstly, there was this joint declaration from the Unionist parties that all the leaders of the main Unionist parties signed up to, in which they were setting out what their opposition to the protocol. So there was that move first. We had a number of months where Jeffrey Donaldson was threatening to do something around power sharing to show the DUP's disdain for the protocol. There was a lot of questions over whether he was actually going to do something. He was accused of crying wolf for a long time, but then in February we eventually got this decision by the DUP to remove the First Minister, Paul Givan, from that First Minister position and effectively collapse the executive. And now we have this odd situation where the DUP is going into a campaign, an election campaign, and is saying it has a 5-point plan to deal with things like problems in the health service in terms of waiting lists, to deal with things like the cost of living crisis. But it is also telling voters that if you give us a mandate, we are not going to go back into the executive until the protocol is resolved. So that therefore could lead to many months without an executive, even though the DUP is telling people that they have a 5-point plan to try and deal with things like the cost of living crisis.
Liz, what have you made of the DUP's approach?
I think it's been strikingly downbeat, and I think that that's not going to play as well as they would perhaps hope. One thing that's always struck me here is the length of the election season and the campaign season, which is markedly shorter than it is where I'm from in the US, which I think is probably a good thing because we spend half of terms campaigning rather than governing. But I think that that's an interesting point, that the DUP have actually effectively been doing this since September, and I don't think it's done them any favors. I think that because they've been effectively campaigning on this one issue for so long, it's left them with very little wiggle room, and it's left them, I think, perhaps slow to be able to convince people that they're about anything besides the protocol. And I don't think that that's going to translate for them. I think that their focus on the protocol above other things, particularly given the cost of living crisis that we're all seeing, really start to hit home now. I don't think that people are going to wait. And I think that they're going to regret focusing on this because it's not actually about going back into governing, and that's what people are looking for, I think.
But now, as we get into the election proper, the DUP is warning against the possibility of Sinn Féin becoming the largest party and holding that First Minister position. And we're returning really to the old arguments that we've seen in past elections, where the DUP is warning that if there is a nationalist First Minister, or the nationalism holds the position of largest party, that in the DUP's view, that would lead to what it describes as a divisive border poll. Now, as we know, a border poll can only really be decided by the Secretary of State. It's really at his discretion when a border poll is called. So really, whether Sinn Féin or the DUP holds the First Minister position does not have any impact on that. Both the Deputy First Minister and First Minister position are equal in joint roles. So therefore, it really doesn't have any bearing on whether or not there will be a border poll. So it'll be interesting to see whether that tactic, or that what the DUP is trying to get across in the campaign in that respect, whether that will play with Unionist voters' fears, and whether those voters who were thinking about moving to other Unionist parties, whether they will return to the DUP to try and fend off the potential of a Sinn Féin First Minister.
And you've segued very nicely on there, Brendan, to Sinn Féin. So Liz, just what about Sinn Féin's approach? I mean, they've again seem to be playing it a bit safe in this campaign, not giving too many, because of course last time in the campaign there was a lot of, it started off very dull, but then Arlene Foster of course made that misstep about crocodiles, and that set the campaign alight. Sinn Féin very keen not to do that in reverse this time. So
you get the sense that they're almost rehearsing for taking that First Minister post, that they're rehearsing for being, to really stepping up into an even further leadership position, even though obviously we know that the roles are joint. The fact that there's the first before it is important to people at the minute anyway. And so you do get the sense that they are really trying to position themselves as the grown-ups in the room, I think. And yes, that does lead to a slightly duller campaign, but I think that there haven't been any massive missteps. They are campaigning on the things that they know that have got them votes previously. They've always done well, or at least spoken well, on issues around poverty and cost of living, which are huge topics at the minute. They have a strong track record on Brexit, which is of course contributing to a lot of the issues that we're seeing at the minute. So I don't think that they have an awful lot of work to do, aside from perhaps trying to convince some of those undecided voters, perhaps people who wouldn't consider themselves Republicans or nationalists, to say, look, we're not all only about this. This is, of course, what we are about, but it's not the only thing that we have to offer. And I think that their campaign has really been about demonstrating that they can, or that they would like to deliver for people beyond just the national question. And thus far, I think that they are hitting that note, if that's what they're going for.
yeah, absolutely. And Brendan, this is something that's been often remarked, is being about, how Sinn Féin have kind of nuances at this point out there. They have nuanced their message really in this campaign about trying to move on to other things.
Well, it's interesting, whenever the DUP has been saying that Sinn Féin, if they become the largest party, the first thing they will be doing is pushing for what they describe as a divisive border poll, and that's what they will use that position of being largest party for. The Sinn Féin, while even on the same day as the DUP has been holding events around the campaign, putting forward that message, Sinn Féin has been holding its own events in which it's saying that its main issues are looking at solving problems in the health service and the cost of living crisis. So they're trying to reposition what their main priorities are. And we even have a surprising moment in the campaign whenever Michelle O'Neill, the deputy leader of Sinn Féin, she was asked really about the idea of a border poll, and she said she doesn't think it's something that people are waking up in the morning thinking about at the moment, which is a surprising thing for a Republican leader to say. And then, I was at the Sinn Féin manifesto launch recently, and it was almost as if they were unsure as to how to respond whenever they were asked questions over when they think a border poll should be. Eventually, Mary Lou McDonald suggested that she sees this as a decade of opportunity, but they seem cagey on what to say around this, because they don't want to play into this argument that the DUP is making, that Sinn Féin is all about a border poll. As we know, they are Irish Republicans. They want to see a border poll at some point, but at this moment in this campaign, they want to try and park that, to downplay that, so that they can try and maintain the vote that they already had in the 2017 Assembly election, while also trying to shore up transfers from people who are supporting other parties that wouldn't be as interested in the constitutional question, people who perhaps would be supporting Alliance or the Greens, trying to get more transfers from them so that they can try and retain as many seats as possible. Because what we're seeing in this election campaign is that really it's really going to come down to a question between the DUP and Sinn Féin in terms of who's going to be the largest party, of which is going to retain the most seats, i.e. which is going to lose more seats. So therefore, that's why Sinn Féin is really in this election, and its strategy in this election really is to try and maintain as many of those transfers as possible to keep its candidates above the line whenever the votes are eventually counted.
Liz, just on that kind of approach from Sinn Féin, do you think that could be potentially effective in terms of, as Brendan was pointing out there, it's by transfers. All parties, it's good to get first preferences, but if you can't get a first preference, you can get a second or third. Do you think that could be critical and effective for them?
I think certainly in some constituencies it will be absolutely key where they're going to be more hotly contesting seats in places like West Belfast, for example. I think it's going to be very interesting in terms of the Sinn Féin, the SDLP and People Before Profit as well. So I think that has to come into consideration, certainly. There's always going to be people, however, that are never going to vote for Sinn Féin who are going to be looking for alternatives. But I think that the longer that they are in government and positioning themselves that way, the better chance that they have. Whether that's really going to be enough to bring, for example, more Unionist voters over the line, I think that might be a stretch too far for some people. But those are perhaps the people that they're targeting with look, if you're not going to vote for us, can you at least accept a situation where we are going to be in government and perhaps not vote for the DUP? I think that there's a certain amount of that goes on as well. But obviously there will be certain constituencies where that's going to be absolutely key for them, and where kind of stepping away from more of those divisive issues and really kind of trying to keep on this one narrow track, I think is going to be really important for them.
Brendan.
I think there's just a number of different strategies that Sinn Féin is really trying to deploy within this campaign. Firstly, in terms of nationalism, it is holding up the prospect of holding a First Minister post as being a prize for those who consider themselves nationalists to vote for Sinn Féin instead of other nationalist parties, because they're saying that they're in the cusp of potentially getting that post. But then on the other side of things, they're trying to shore up those transfers. It's trying to align itself really with what it describes as the other progressive parties, so that it is seen as really part of their orbit, and the DUP is off to one side, and so therefore they're hoping that really that those transfers, whenever we're counting down the ballot, will be going towards Sinn Féin candidates.
Okay. And Alliance, obviously, being the focus of the last couple of campaigns for doing well in 2019. But again, what we're all scratching our heads about is, does that hold for 2022? Liz, what do you think about Alliance's campaign, how they've gone about their approach? Obviously utilising Naomi Long, but obviously trying to make a breakthrough.
I think that they've relied very heavily on Naomi Long, which means for me I find it very difficult to name more Alliance candidates than the one that is standing in my own constituency. I think that they've played a very safe campaign. I think that I actually would have liked to see them push it out a little bit more. I think that because that they've really kind of relied on old messaging, haven't really shifted too much. And in fact, the changes in their slogan, I think, has actually been to their detriment. I don't think it's been as strong as previous campaigns. And I'm not really sure why that is. I think that they have a strong record to point to in the Assembly. I think that there's definitely been a lot more support for them since the last election, or at least people talking as if they support Alliance. And I suppose that's where my question is going to be on Election Day, is a lot of the discourse is as if Alliance is gaining, and people are talking about Alliance, and they're talking about finding this middle ground and finding progressive politics. But I'm not convinced that that's actually going to translate to actual support for Alliance to more seats. I think that they have yet to have any of their other MLAs make real names for themselves, despite the fact that they've had quite a lot of legislative gains in this last mandate. Certainly Kelly Armstrong with her integrated education bill. But it's been a safe campaign for me, and I think that there's all to play for in this election, certainly with people much more focused on bread and butter issues. And I haven't seen them step into the space the way that I would have expected or wanted them to really capture those votes and capitalize on it.
Brendan, Brendan, what have you made? Because that, interesting, that's not the first comment I've heard about Alliance in that respect, about it's been a bit surprising about we expected a bit more from the campaign, particularly from Alliance, because you'd assume this would be their golden opportunity to make those inroads?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the Alliance campaign really hasn't been, I suppose, as vibrant as people were perhaps expecting going into this election cycle. As you've said, they changed their election slogan from previously it was this "Demand Better" slogan, which seemed to resonate with a lot of voters and got them a lot of support in 2019 in that cycle of elections. But now they're running with this slogan, "Together we can." It doesn't seem to resonate as much. It doesn't seem to be driving people as much in terms of what we're seeing on the doors and people speaking about the election. It feels like, even just watching the Alliance Party election broadcast, it feels really like Alliance on autopilot. They're saying these sorts of slogans that we'd expect of Alliance, but there's nothing really that new or exciting coming from them. And there is very much, again, a reliance on Naomi Long as being their best performer to sort of drive this campaign, and not really much of a focus on other candidates. I suppose they did try and focus on some of the candidates within their party election broadcast by giving them some airtime, but really it is still the Naomi show, and a lot of that support for Alliance will probably be driven by how she performs in upcoming television debates, rather than what we have seen during the rest of the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting about how, and we'll get on to some of the other parties later, about how Alliance really do focus on Naomi Long, and it seems to have worked for them in previous campaigns. Why do you think Alliance have opted for that approach? That's because obviously, across many different constituencies, Alliance are trying. I mean, Alliance are expansive across this campaign. They're the ones that certainly the media are talking about. Have the greatest potential of gains. I mean, not to say obviously no one's voted yet, but they seem to have the greatest potential. So why have they not gone? Why have they gone that low-level approach?
Well, I actually wonder if it's their approach or if it's just that the field is a little bit more crowded when it comes to progressive politics now, when it comes to alternatives to Sinn Féin, the DUP, UUP, SDLP. I think that the Greens have really made a strong showing in the last while. And I think that means that space that we would normally only put Alliance in, that we would expect them to say the things that they're saying and not hear it from anywhere else, it's not like that anymore. So it could be that they're not doing anything particularly different than they have in recent years. They're relying on Naomi Long because, as it's been said, she's been very strong and she's a very popular politician. But I think that it's actually that we're hearing the same sorts of messages that Alliance has been giving, and people going further, people promising more, people suggesting that actually the sorts of policies that Alliance are putting forward aren't enough anymore. So I think that has inadvertently detracted from their message, and they haven't come out strong enough behind themselves in a way to make themselves the loudest voices within that middle ground. So it's quite possibly not anything that they're doing or not doing, just the fact that there's just a lot more people out there now that are getting a lot more support. That middle ground is opening up. They're no longer the only ones standing there, and they're going to have to perhaps change tack.
Yeah.
The other aspect of this as well is that for the past 2 years, Alliance Party has been part of a 5-party executive, so it really is in effect part of the establishment in terms of Northern Ireland politics, and therefore you have a differentiation between Alliance, as part of this establishment within the power sharing executive, and, for example, the Green Party, who at their party election manifesto launch were describing themselves as being the foremost opposition party, even though they only at the last election had 2 MLAs. So, that way they're trying to differentiate themselves from the Alliance Party, and Alliance can't do that, although they previously, whenever there was no executive up and running for 3 years as a result of the RHI controversy, they were able to, I suppose, differentiate themselves from the DUP and Sinn Féin, and put forward this slogan of demanding better and getting back into government. Whenever you're part of government, it's much more difficult to put forward that same slogan. Instead, you're running on a campaign of saying, look what we've achieved during those 2 years, and we're a party of delivery. So I think that's what Alliance is trying to put forward at this time. They're trying to say that we are about making politics work, about making delivery within politics, and so therefore more Alliance ministers would deliver that, and then accusing the rest of the parties of causing dysfunction and tensions within the executive. So really that's what they're focusing on, but it's just not as strong a campaign as what we've seen previously.
Okay, so moving on to another party in this race, the SDLP. Of course, they're fighting. This is Colm Eastwood's third assembly election as leader in the 6 years or so that he's been at the helm. Liz, the approach from the SDLP, obviously, slogans, but people first. They're obviously trying to maybe be a bit more kind of broaden their support base, obviously, away, focusing very much on the cost of living crisis, trying to differentiate themselves there as well, but also trying to, critique the executive, but also try and sell Nicola Mallon's record as infrastructure minister. What have you made of their campaign?
I think it's interesting that you say that they've been trying to differentiate themselves when the first thing that I think of when I look at an SDLP election poster is, oh, I thought that was people before profit, because that's what it looks like. And I think that they're really trying to position themselves in that space. I'm not at all convinced that that's going to work for them. I don't think that their record and on a diverse array of issues is going to stand up to being positioned explicitly or implicitly next to a party like People Before Profit or other progressive parties. I'm not suggesting that SDLP isn't progressive, but I'm not convinced that strategy is going to pay out the way that they would perhaps want to. I don't think that what we're getting from them is SDLP. I'm not sure where their voice, their vision is. I think that it was a communications decision and obviously I know that their campaign is broader than just posters, but those are the things that the people see every single day, and that sticks. And I've had actually quite a few conversations with people who have said the same thing, and it feels very cynical. So I find that very disappointing, personally. I think that their campaign has been disappointing. I think that some of the decisions that they've made about the pitch and tone of it, implicitly or explicitly, are not going to be enough to differentiate them, to put them out in front of other parties. I suspect that they are still going to be second, third preference in a lot of places where there are parties with stronger messaging, stronger track record, who have really set themselves apart in a way that I just don't think that the SDLP have managed to do this time.
Brendan, what do you think? Anything about the SDLP's campaign? Do you think that they've maybe done some things right, or do you agree with Liz's assessment about their approach?
Well, I think if we're looking first of all of what the key talking points of this campaign are, perhaps the SDLP has got it right in some respects. They are campaigning really on, their message is people first. That's their main strap line. And Colm Eastwood has been, as the party leader, has been appearing in interviews and trying to put across that his view, the cost of living crisis, is the main issue. So in terms of, if you're trying to position yourself in terms of what you think the main issues are for voters, then perhaps that is the right space for the SDLP to be in, because we have seen other parties move into that space whenever previously they weren't even talking about those sorts of issues. So perhaps they have done some things right. I suppose we won't know until we see the votes being counted. Although in terms of the colour red, I think what is interesting and perhaps not the best move is to decide to hire a red battle bus to travel around Northern Ireland to the various constituencies, not least because for many people it will evoke images of the EU referendum Vote Leave campaigns, big red battle bus, and some of the pledges that were made on that bus. But the main challenge really for the SDLP is on the side of nationalism. You have the problem of facing the challenge of Sinn Féin, who are not like the DUP in terms of not having the same internal problems that are playing out within the campaign and are more open to being attacked from all sides. The DUP seeing that in terms of its vote being split among Unionist parties. You're not getting that with Sinn Féin, and they're holding up the carrot really for nationalism, of the prospect of nationalism having the largest party and also holding that First Minister position. And then on the other side for the SDLP, you're potentially seeing people who would be more interested in some of the other SDLP policies instead migrating towards really Alliance and the Greens, who would see them as being, those parties as being more effective on issues potentially like the cost of living crisis and things like that. So really that's where the SDLP is falling down. It's trying to do too many things at the same time. It doesn't have a clear message therefore, and is potentially getting caught in the middle.
Okay, moving on to a party which is probably the one that is utilising its executive presence, I think, the most out of them all, the Ulster Unionist Party. Robin Swan, their health minister, is being part of their campaign. and they're obviously trying to run on that record. So Liz, I'll start with you first. The Ulster Unionist campaign is Doug Beattie's first campaign overall as leader. He's never actually fought a campaign at any level for the Ulster Unionist Party. What have you made of their approach?
Well, I think that they've done particularly well, considering that there was a bit of a scandal, I suppose we could say, a while back regarding Doug Beattie and his old tweets. So I think the fact that the party has seemed to have moved past that, largely, I haven't seen an awful lot of anything dealing with that recently. I think that that's a testament to the message that they've been putting out. I think in contrast to a lot of the other campaigns that we've been seeing, their message is clear. And I think they're able to take that space because the DUP and other unionist parties have left it open. There haven't been, there's that space for a party that says, we are a unionist party. This is what we believe when it comes to the Constitution. And here are all our other policies when it comes to dealing with your life on a daily basis. And I think that that's refreshing for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are engaging with that and feeling like they have a place to put those concerns that they've had for a long time, while not having to necessarily deal with the perhaps difficult decision of crossing over to another side of the fence, or choosing maybe a party that isn't as big, that they're not as comfortable or knowledgeable about. So I think that there's definitely space there that was left for them, that they stepped into quite confidently. And so in that regard, I think Doug Beattie's done a good job of leading the party in there. Whether that's going to translate obviously remains to be seen. I think that that's just one of those big questions that we can sit and try and predict all we want, but there's been so many upsets, so many kind of twists and turns over the last few elections that I wouldn't like to call it. But in terms of of the campaign of the party, I think it's been outward facing. I think it's been had a lot of energy behind it, and really kind of confidently tried to carve out this space for itself. And I think actually a really big moment for that party was when Doug Beattie said that he was no longer going to be attending or supporting the protocol protests. I think that put a lot of clear water in between the UUP and the DUP TUV that really gives people more of a choice. So it'll be interesting to see whether they take that choice or not.
Yeah, Brendan, what have you made of the Ulster Unionists so far? I mean, going into the campaign, it looked like they may struggle to get a bit of traction, or they may struggle just because they electorally have had a tough couple of years. What have you made of their approach?
Well, just picking up on the protocol aspect of things, the anti-protocol rallies, I think that did have the potential to set clear blue water between the UUP and other unionist parties, by Doug Beattie saying that he wasn't going to attend those rallies, saying that he was concerned that they were ratcheting up tensions during the campaign. However, the problem in relation to that is that there has been mixed messages in relation to the anti-protocol rallies, and so therefore the UUP looks really a bit muddled on that, because we have Doug Beattie saying that he is not attending these rallies for this reason, but then we are seeing other people within the party, including his running mate in his constituency, as well as others, councillors, etc., different members of the party at different levels, attending these rallies and making up various rationale and excuses for why they are attending, even though their leader is not attending. So it's created, as time has gone on, mixed messages within the Ulster Unionists over where they stand on the protocol, and I think that's actually created some ammunition for other unionist parties to say that the Ulster Unionists don't really know where they stand in relation to opposing the protocol and how to oppose it effectively. So I think unfortunately that has been a problem for them, instead of creating this clear blue water between them and other parties. And I think that I see that across the Ulster Unionists in terms of other policies as well. We have Doug Beattie presenting himself as being this, I suppose, socially liberal, progressive unionist leader that is open to what he describes as a union of people. But then we're seeing, the controversy around his past tweets, and we're seeing, other people within the party taking different stances on different issues. So it's hard to know where the UUP stands on anything in particular going into this campaign, and so therefore voters are likely to go to other parties if they want a stronger stance on different issues. Okay, and
Liz, just in terms of their utilisation of their record in the executive, obviously I think it's very fair to say the most high profile minister over the past 2.5 years has been the health minister, Robin Swan, but the pandemic, whilst it's still amongst us, is receding as an issue. You're seeing it falling down the news agenda. 3 p.m. every day, you would look out for the COVID stats, and now, we're seeing the end of mass testing, we're seeing the end of that. Is there a risk that potentially, as that issue falls, that may not be the electoral boon that we may have thought maybe just 3 months ago for the Ulster?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, while we're all happy to see COVID receding, at least in some ways, it's not going to play to their favour at all. I think a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have been behind Robin Swan for any other reason really were during the pandemic. I think we all were, because we needed to be, and we needed him to deliver. And by and large, I would say that he has. But now the most common articles and things that you see on, within the news and in terms of the health service are waiting lists and some really horrible, tragic cases of ambulances not getting to people who needed it and people dying as a result. Not only is that horrendous and not something that we should ever have to deal with in society, but that's absolutely not going to look good for a party who's relying on a health minister. So yeah, I think that that's going to be a huge issue for them, particularly if they're standing on their track record. And at the minute, the thing that is in people's minds isn't that. It's a whole range of other issues, from the energy crisis to cost of living and health service, and how nobody can get near a hospital or a GP, and all of those things are piling up. And the thing is, the public have very short-term memories. We all do, really, when it comes to these issues, and I think that is going to be a problem for them.
Right. So Liz, obviously earlier in the programme you were referencing the difference between campaigns here and back in your home country of the United States, where you guys have campaigns that go for nearly 2 years, some point for the presidential campaign. How have you, just from growing up in that environment, and obviously you grew up in a swing state as well, so Wisconsin, so obviously big interest there. How does that compare to how campaigns are run there, to your experience of, obviously you live here and made your life here now, so?
Yeah, there's definitely a different feel and character to them. I said that they last a long time. They're seemingly endless. I've seen a lot of the characteristics of American elections, at least that have come about during my period as a voter, from I was 18 to now, and really coming over here, and the kind of making politics, or trying to make politics a bit shinier, making everything about sound bites, that kind of thing, I think has become a lot more Americanized, which I don't think is a positive thing at all. But really, when it gets down to it, I think that when I look at the difference between campaigns here and campaigns in the US, it's more, you wouldn't think this perhaps, but it's actually more civil here, I find. I find that the shorter election period, or the campaign period, is really positive, because I think that it forces parties to govern right up into the last minute. Certainly with this mandate, we saw that because of the fall of the executive, and there was a rush to get all of these bills through. I think that's a really positive thing, because it means that parties can't just walk away halfway through and go, well, and basically obstruct everything and make it all about the election, because then you're just jumping from election to election, and it becomes about whatever you can grab in between. So I think that that's a really positive thing. But I do think that the increased polarization of politics in the US is not confined to there. And obviously Northern Ireland is no stranger to polarized politics. I wouldn't like to suggest that we invented it and gave it to you or anything like that. But I think that the way that it's been communicated, and the way that it has translated into day-to-day relationships with people, I see that happening more and more on a broader range of issues, going beyond the constitutional question. I see there being a lot more difficulty within personal relationships on, kind of vaccine issues, other issues that are in the press. And I didn't really notice that as much when I first moved here about 13 years ago. So I think that the nature of politics is shifting and changing. So it's interesting to watch, for sure. I'm hoping that this is my last election as a non-voter, not by choice, by the way. I'm a firm believer in voting, so I would if I could. It's a tricky thing to watch politics play out around you, particularly when you're living here, working, raising a family, and you're not able to vote. So I suppose this is my evergreen plea to people who can vote, and I know that there are ideological and other reasons why people choose not to vote. But as someone who is not able to, I urge everyone to do it, because it kind of stinks when you can't. Yeah, amen to that. Brendan, obviously you've been active in journalism now for around about 10 years as well. You have been back here now covering a couple of assembly elections now, from 2016, 2017 and now 2022.
Where are you putting this in terms of interest, substance, in comparison to the others that you've looked at?
Well, it feels like this election campaign has been going on for more than 6 months now. It feels like we've been in election mode for that long, because we've all been gearing up for this moment, really. That whenever the votes are eventually cast and counted. But I think as we've got closer to the actual polling day, there has been a bit of a drop off in terms of momentum. There has been the Easter break in the middle of it, which seems to have meant that parties have seemingly taken a break in terms of the public campaigning. Of course, although they're always out in the doors and canvassing people in that regard, but there has been a lack of energy in the campaign. I'm hoping to see as we get towards the final days that there will be a bit more of a energy from the parties as they put forward their final pitch to voters. But I think a lot of people are really looking at what will happen after the election. Are we going to be seeing an executive coming back within the next few days after the election, or will it be the case, which seems to be in all likelihood, that we won't have an executive in place for perhaps 6 months or more because of the parties having disagreements over things like the Northern Ireland Protocol and what sort of programme for government we have. And the other question as well is, depending on what sort of outcome we have in terms of what parties get seats, is whether the institutions will need to be reformed or changed as a result to take account of that. Because as we know, we have operated since the time that devolution has been in place, we have operated in this space where really nationalism and unionism are the largest blocks. But we are seeing that increase in unaligned or parties who describe themselves as other in the Assembly. And if that bloc becomes much larger, it really is a case for reforming how the institutions work in future. Okay, well, I think we covered as many bases there as we possibly could. Thank you very much for coming in. That just leaves me to say a big thank you to you for watching, and also to my guests, Liz Nelson and Brendan Hughes. Polls open at 7 a.m. on May 5th. Make sure you exercise your right to vote, as Liz was saying. That's all we have time for this edition of Slugger TV. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with everything on sluggerotoole.com. Thank you for watching.